started, it's, in case you haven't, the descriptions of the Samaya vow, that mantra to realize the intrinsic identity of yourself, all other beings, and the Buddha, and practicing the fundamental vow of universal compassion. So this is, there was a question on Reddit recently, and someone asked about Shingon, especially the concept of Sokushin Jokutsu, the idea of attaining enlightenment in this lifetime. So it's considered to be a fundamental core theory in Shingon, and it's understood from two perspectives. One, that Shingon says, yes, you can achieve enlightenment in this very lifetime. And then also it announces that that's possible through a particular method. And a lot of that theory is understood through the method. And this part, when you're doing the Samaya vow, is the beginning step. Actually, it really underlies the method. The idea of the combining body, speech, and mind, the three mysteries. And here it's announced as having that realization that ourselves, all other beings, and the Buddha are fundamentally the same. It's a deep realization. So of course we say it, with a logical mind and intellectualize it, but through practice you're really trying to have that identification, and that's what starts to break down barriers between yourself and others, barriers between ideas of acceptance of others or even others' way of life, and the list goes on and on. So that we're not seeing separation constantly, right? You look out and you see interconnectedness. And of course we see everything as separate. Our language is based on making distinctions and separateness. This thing over there, this thing close to here, that thing far over there. You learn it, especially in Japanese. You have kore, are, dore, all these different ways of distinguishing location and distinguishing separation. So we don't generally go about our lives, because so much of our thinking is in language, making generalizations such as, all of us here together, especially the gentleman in the blue shirt sitting in the middle of all of us right now. We don't talk in this way. When we say, Bob there in the blue shirt, not John in the red shirt. This kind of. So we make distinctions. So part of the theory is we're using mantra to, I say reprogram. It has negative connotations, but maybe in a computer science connotation, literally recode our thought process, so that when we look out in the world, we don't instantly start making distinctions. We don't start from a basis of distinction. We start from a basis of identification of ourselves with another person, and then that builds compassion. And the next step is identifying that there's no separation between ourselves and the Buddha, and that's how we recognize our Buddha nature. So that's the method. In a logical sense, we've done it the opposite way for so long. It takes practice. So, like anything, right? Imagine an old building that's been neglected and hasn't been used appropriately. You've got to go through, there's going to be a lot of cleaning and sorting and repainting and patching, and before it feels like someone's breathed life into it again. So, but that potential is always there, right? In fact, thanks to the magic of something like HGTV, very nearly something falling down still has potential. Or we salvaged these boards from a barn and we built something new. So the potential is always there, but it takes work. So that's the same idea here. So that's the part of the underlying meaning when we're starting the service, to have that idea. So that's what we're working on. So we come together to work on that. Okay. So we're going to continue with the Vimalakirti Sutra. Then we'll do some meditation. And the reason for doing it backwards is we haven't been on the topic of the sutra for a while. But it helps, I think, to sometimes have these concepts in mind and then do the meditation to look inside. And sometimes when we do it the opposite way, sometimes we forget. We go, oh, I wish I would had that in mind when I was doing the meditation. I would have done better, or I would have had a deeper insight. So we're going to do it that way. So I think we left off at the beginning of chapter 6. Okay. So that was the end of August. So we're looping back around. So because it's been a while, I'm going to do a little re-review. And then we'll start to go a little bit further into chapter 6. And then we'll leave the rest for November. That's the next time we'll pick this up. So, if my notes are accurate, we are over a year into the Vimalakirti Sutra. So that's quite... I actually kept notes on the dates here, so we've been doing this one for a while. So we'll see how far we get this evening. So this chapter 6 is relatively short. So it's chapter 6, the inconceivable. And I think last time we went over a little bit of why it's called the inconceivable and what is being discussed in the chapter. So this chapter starts off with Vimalakirti pointing out Sariputra's thought process. And from our standpoint, we might say, oh, he's finding fault or criticizing Sariputra, but actually it's a great opportunity for us to think about our own minds and our thought process, and kind of a underlying conundrum that if you study Buddhist texts, you'll eventually say, well, yeah, how does that work? And that is, we're supposed to free ourselves of seeking, but at the same time we're seeking and striving for enlightenment. We're trying to develop compassion. So we're putting effort into something. We want to make progress, and yet the text tells us if you're seeking to make progress, you're not going to make progress. So this is can be a puzzle. And if you're seeking to develop compassion, you was like, well, yeah, I should develop compassion. And then it says as soon as you're seeking something, then you're failing. Wait. So this is Vimalakirti, I think, very expertly starts the chapter off pointing that out with Sariputra. So he asks him, at this point, Sariputra saw that there were no seats in the room, so everyone's getting ready to hear more of this conversation between Manjushri and Vimalakirti. And Sariputra naturally, right, as a student, one of the Buddhist students, says, well, where's everyone going to sit? So this is natural, right? Anytime you are in that role as assistant, or you're going to learn, especially in a more traditional fashion, you might have this idea. So now, a long time ago, when I was teaching in China, it was very common for whomever was the classroom leader to do that last minute scramble 3 minutes before the teacher is going to come in or the speaker is going to speak, saying, did anyone make tea? And you see them go running out, and then they make tea, and then they put the teacup on the desk and then go running to sit down so that it's there. But in many ways, that was sort of the very least the class could do to show their respect towards the teacher and so that they're ready to learn. And understanding that if there's going to be a long lecture, they might need to sip tea or have some water. So Sariputra is going through the same idea. I'm getting ready to get this really important teaching, and out of respect for my teachers, where are they going to sit? Where's everyone else going to sit? Where's the assembly going to sit? And how can they really get into this discourse if they're not comfortable, right? Because the room is empty. So of course we remember back, Vimalakirti specifically made the room empty. He emptied the room of all furniture, all servants and everything. And so of course, if we think about it a little bit, this is the, empty our minds of these preconceived notions. But also, if we think about it in terms of our spiritual practice, we want to take anything out of the practice space that's not needed for the practice. So there's a reason why we don't have a TV in here. There's a reason why we're not playing the radio in the background. So when we're doing the practice, we try to keep it specifically structured on that. So if you do like a sesshin, like in Zen, you're going to go and do a very rigorous meditation retreat. Some of them, you're facing the wall and it's just the wood paneling, or you may be looking at the tatami mat and nothing else. In Shingon, you're going to have a very prescribed way of arranging ritual implements and arranging things so you don't have extraneous things. It might look somewhat busy, like there's more, but it's laid out in a very particular way. And you'll often see, especially if there's someone visiting another temple, there's a lot of this sort of like, okay, now I can do the meditation, or it's not quite right. So the arrangement becomes important to what you're going to do. So Vimalakirti said, well, we're going to arrange the room as empty space, because that's important for what's about to happen, right? That's the appropriate arrangement. But for Shariputra's like, where are the chairs, right? So his mind stops. So it's important to think about from the standpoint of, we talked a little bit more in terms of the in-depths, what Vimalakirti is trying to teach Shariputra here, but it also helps to refresh, where does our mind stop, right? Where do we, in a very, very practical sense, what do we allow to get in the way of our development, right? So, what are the typical things? You have a lifelong dream to do something, and you let something get in the way because you think, well, I set it up and it has to come about in the way that I dreamed of it coming about. Then you miss an opportunity because you're not flexible enough to allow it to develop in a different way. Or you place unnecessary obstacles in your way. Before I can do this, I have to do this, and this. Well, who says that? Maybe there's a different way to do it. So even if there's something we want to do, even there's something we plan to do, we still have to have flexibility. We have to leave space, right? Just like Vimalakirti has left space. In order to be successful, you have to leave space to change direction. If you think about it like military theory, like there are strategic retreats, right? We retreat, restructure, and then we change direction. Not we're giving up, necessarily. Same thing in business, right? Okay, this product didn't do well, so we need to move back, cut our losses, and then launch a new initiative. But sometimes we think, okay, this is absolutely the way it has to be, it's going to be wonderful, and we put everything out there and it falls flat. And sometimes it could have been avoided if we had more flexibility, if we had space, right? Where do we have that space? So that's a very necessary skill for spiritual development. When I started, right, in Buddhism, I had a certain idea of, well, Buddhism is this thing, and that's the way it has to be, right? I'm going to meet this old, wizened, enlightened master, and, actually, I think I probably learned more from unenlightened and just as confused peers and seekers on the way, right, along the way. So you often don't get the information from the source that you thought you would get it. In fact, when I get the Koya-san for the first time, the person who's introducing me to a lot of the teachings, you could definitely say was more in the crazy wisdom, scheme of things, not the old wizened sort of, almost like a jester type character. But that was good because it was forcing me to confront thought process and retool my thinking and become flexible. So sometimes we miss opportunities because we say, well, it has to be this way. This is my expectation. If my expectation is not met, then I'm out of here. So that's just as much an obstacle. So for Sariputra, he is shocked at times with the discourse, but he's willing to go with it. He's not going to get up and walk out. He's going to say, well, I recognize these are enlightened masters and I have something to learn. But his mind's still getting stuck on basic things. And this is where, if we're reading the sutra, we have to stop and say, okay, well, where would my mind get stuck? Where do I usually get stuck, right? Where do I go in and say, well, things have to be this way? Or I have a preconceived notion of the way it has to be, and then I have difficulty when people have a different opinion? Or, where do I get hung up? So that becomes an issue. So this is where the wisdom of the sutra can be very helpful for us. So there has to be kind of a back and forth dialogue between ourselves and the text. We can't just read it because we probably aren't in the exact same position that Sariputra's in, right? I it's not my experience to follow the Buddha around every day, right? And literally sit at his feet. So what is my position? And think about that. What would so here's a big meeting. So let's update it. You're in charge of the CEO. You go out to a big meeting and you're getting ready to prepare for the meeting. If what would be missing that would throw you off completely, right? The CEO says, oh, go to the cleaners to get my suit, and you're like, oh, and the cleaner's like, we lost the clothes, and you're like, what do I do? Do I go buy another outfit? What if it doesn't fit? What do I do, right? So is that the most important thing for the presentation? Or can the CEO get up and say, hey, in fact, my suit is lost, so, well, heck, this is Apple, so we can do this in black turtlenecks and jeans, because that's cool, right? And that's just going to become our look or something. So maybe you can retool. Maybe you can, readjust. So you often hear, the behind-the-scenes story, especially like in Hollywood or in music. Somebody says, oh, that's a really interesting style. They're like, actually, it's not a style. It's just all I had at the moment. And because I went out and gave such a great performance, it became stylish. Or, there's a lot of stories like this where people will actually, let me tell you the backstory to that. So the key is, can you become, be flexible in this way, in this thinking? So that part I think is really important, because in our daily life, we have natural obstacles, we have natural hardships, we have like natural tragedies, right? So, the Buddha said, in life, there's things that are inescapable, right? Birth is inescapable, aging is inescapable, sickness is inescapable, and death is inescapable, right? At some point, we're going to experience all of these. All the rest of the stuff, though, is really self-produced obstacles. And however, though, those can be really debilitating for us. So we are raised in a particular way to think, it has to be this way, or we have to be a certain way. And someone doesn't approve of our choices or the way we go about things, and that then becomes an extra hurdle and burden that we put on ourselves. So those things then exacerbate how we age, right? Those things exacerbate the sicknesses we get, or they may accelerate the death process, or hinder or change the natural rhythms of birth, right? All these things can be affected. But, those basic underlying teaching of the Buddha are the only things that are guaranteed. Everything else is, we opt into, we make choices, we create that reality for ourselves. So that, I think, if you go back and look at this beginning part of the sutra, becomes very helpful to understand. The other part here is this second sentence. It says, Vimalakirti said, O Sariputra, those who seek the Dharma should begrudge neither body nor life. How much more so a seat? this I think is really important. So Vimalakirti, of course, there's nothing wrong with the chair, but he doesn't want Sariputra completely stuck on, I can't do anything or I can't hear this lesson without a place to sit, right? Because then you miss your opportunity. I can remember times in college you get to class maybe late and there's no place to sit, so you stand in the back, but I'm not going to say, oh, no place to sit, I'm leaving. Sometimes those are the best lectures, maybe you learn more. So don't let those little things get in the way of your experiences. But a key thing here is, you should begrudge neither body nor life. There are a lot of books written about great Buddhist masters, especially in the sutras. There's less written about so-so students of the Dharma. So, when we read sometimes the harrowing tales of them seeking the Dharma and studying and practicing, we might say, how am I ever going to do that? Right? So tomorrow we're going to show the Kukai movie, right? So he goes to China, and that part of the journey is, graphically detailed, and it's not easy. So we might think, wow, do I have to do that to get the Dharma? Well, no, of course not, right? There's other people that, maybe lived at the bottom of Koyasan and went on a long walk one day and are like, oh, there's a temple up here, I didn't know. And, I think I'll stay, it's such a lovely place. And it was very easy for them. But what's important here is, I think, in our modern times, how do we look at it, right? We should not begrudge the body. So I think for our modern life, the body is a huge obstacle for a variety of reasons. People have a lot of energy placed into what does the body look like, how healthy is the body. If you go on social media, there's a lot of people, whomever is in the gym lets you know they're in the gym. And that's different from the way things used to be. As soon as they change, waist size or dress size, there's a big announcement about it. So that sometimes has an effect on the way we view our body and then what we think we can do. So, and then likewise, when we read the sutra, we see, these like superhuman feats of meditative ability and, living in a mountain and eating only, herbs collected on the shaded side on the north between 1 and 2 in the morning. It goes into like great detail. And we think, oh, do I have to suffer that much in order to do this? So the answer is, none of those are exactly right. But for some people, that's their path. And it should inspire us. But we can also do it right here in a room that's warm enough. Not quite warm, but warm enough. And, with the body we have, no matter what size or shape it is. When I was in training in Japan, I don't fit in Japan. I don't fit in the buildings. I didn't fit on the tatami mat. I didn't fit. Everything was too small for my frame. So I could say, well, they need to change it, or I don't belong here, or just laugh and say, okay, well, unfortunately, be this big gangly Westerner, and so you get funny stories, and that's fine. But the body can be. Going to Asia showed me. In America, people say, "Oh, you're tall, and thin." Okay, and I go to Asia, and there people are like, "You're just huge," and I compare it to a sumo wrestler at that. And they're like, "What? No, I don't think so." Really? But it's a different perspective. So you say, okay, well, no matter that, right? This body is still useful for learning the Dharma. Right? It doesn't matter. That's not an obstacle. It's just a difference. So that could be something, I think, when we read sutras. I've heard from a lot of people, they say, well, Buddhism's nothing but suffering and this, that, and the other. And no, not at all. Actually, that's not at all the point. but the Buddha doesn't sugarcoat the teaching about life. And no matter what, you still have access, right? You still have access, but you can't, as Vimalakirti says, begrudge the body. But that also doesn't mean that you destroy the body in the process of pursuing the Dharma. So I'm going to get now to the point that I made in the beginning. So this, how do you seek without seeking? And this part is pretty interesting. So I think he has a quote here. So Sariputra, in seeking the Dharma, one should not be attached to the Buddha in seeking, nor be attached to the Dharma in seeking, nor be attached to the congregation, the Sangha, in seeking. In seeking the Dharma, one should seek without recognizing suffering. One should seek without cutting off the accumulation of suffering. One should seek without contriving the complete realization and cultivation of the path. Why? The Dharma is without contrived theories. If one says, I will recognize suffering, cut off the accumulation of suffering, and realize the extinction of suffering and cultivate the path, this would be a contrived theory and not to seek the Dharma. So, seek without seeking. How do you do that? It seems puzzling, but I think a good part of this translation is it would be a contrived theory. So again, going into it with, it's going to be this way. I'm going to sit down on the cushion, I'm going to meditate for 100 hours, and I'm going to get it. Right? It's going to be exactly the way I say. I'm going to become this great, compassionate being, and it's never going to be the way you think it's going to be. It's always going to turn out differently. The key is you put effort into the practice. How it plays out, I've never met anyone for whom it has played out the way they thought. Everyone, in fact, I just had a conversation with a fellow cultivator the other day on Facebook, and they were in a foreign country, and they asked the question, how was it on Koyasan for you? And they were very honest, and they said, I thought it would be easy. And because of that, it was harder than I ever imagined. But now they have this really, really deep appreciation for what they did. So it changed them. And I think that's part of the key concept of seeking without seeking. That you have to give up what you think it's going to be. You have to put your effort into it. But you can't say, well, it has to be this way or that way, or it has to turn out a particular direction, or if it doesn't work in a particular way. And I think, how do you do that? I think you engage with the teaching. And so rather than seeking, or even cultivating, you abandon seeking and you just engage with the practice. It means really engaging. So in the traditional sense, that was almost like an apprenticeship. You didn't know what was coming next. You just did what the teacher said to do that day, or you followed and you watched. And if eventually they said, okay, now you do it. Oh, it's time for me to do it? I don't know, right? So these days, of course, people learn differently. So that model isn't exactly necessarily practical in all scenarios. But it does mean, let's say, you go to the temple without a particular goal in mind and just ask, how can I be helpful? And you might find a tremendous insight in what may seem like mundane duties on that day. So I had this experience, right, working in the garden and thinking like, oh, it's nothing but work in the garden. But I had always viewed, it was a Japanese garden in Japan, so I always viewed the garden from one perspective. And of course, a key feature of any garden is viewing it from different perspectives. So when I got to the back behind the shrub and I'm trimming something and I look back into the garden, I have a completely different perspective, and I'm like, oh, this is why it's designed this way, right? Or I didn't realize, in fact, that there was, the small hill to the side, and you see things differently, completely differently. But I didn't go in with this contrived sense of, I'm going to master the garden or something today, and I will come out of it as a gardening master or something. No, I just came into it like, oh, we're doing yard work today. Okay. Sure, that's what we're doing today. So this is how. I think it's just this engagement. So in our culture, if we look around, we see temples, incense, statues. So we say, are the incense and statues fundamentally necessary to the practice? No. However, it's incredibly useful, right? Is a rake fundamentally necessary for, gathering all the leaves in the yard during the fall? No, it can be done a different way, but it's really helpful. So someone may say, abandon all rakes, give up your attachment to rakes. The leaf blower is the one true way. Okay, well, there's benefits to that, but also you lose something, right? There's something incredibly satisfying about raking the yard, raking leaves, and you have a greater sense of connection to the lawn and the yard when you use a rake. I think probably that's the way it's been for a long time, which is a fundamentally different thing than leaf blower, right? Which is also completely different from a riding mower that sucks them up, right? So these are all qualitatively different experiences. So if the goal is only to remove the leaves, then any of those tools are good. If the goal is for you to really tend to the yard, probably the rake is still the best. Because then you can get at the thatch and the grass, and maybe there's seeds, and you can, I see what needs to be done, and I need to patch that area, and you have a different experience. But that grows out of me having raked a lot of yards in the Midwest and gotten up a lot of leaves. Without doing that, someone passing by could say, well, just get the leaf blower. Right? Well, when I first started raking, there were no leaf blowers. Right? And when I first saw a leaf blower, there were also no big riding mowers with leaf suckers on them, or whatever those things are called. So this was an evolution. So I have a different perspective than people later. And in fact, I remember before there were plastic rakes, and it was only the bamboo rake, and when one of them broke, and then you had to rake around the broken tooth, and then get the plastic one, and it was bigger, and you're like, I can cover more ground, this is amazing. And then the quality of them went down, they broke really quick, and you pined for the old bamboo rakes with the metal. So anyway, but it's an experience, it's engagement. Yeah, it's engagement with this practice. Something as simple as raking the leaves, which you find out isn't so simple. And so spiritual practice is this way. So if you go in saying, I'm going to master the teaching and attain enlightenment, that may or may not happen on the cushion. That may or may not happen even in meditation. It might happen raking the lawn. But you're not going to get to that point unless you really engage with the practice. So that's where you give up seeking, and you're just working with engagement. Right? So you're not looking for anything in particular anymore. You're just, there's this continued engagement. So I think that's, in many ways, how we can view this idea of giving up the seeking. And yet, staying engaged is still moving us forward, but we're not, with every stroke of the rake saying, is enlightenment coming now? Is enlightenment coming now? I'm going to rake the lawn specifically with the intent of achieving enlightenment. No. You rake the lawn with the intent of doing it well, doing it with awareness, not doing it with half your mind on something else. And then when you come back to your meditation, you may find the quality of your meditation is different. So this is what I found with washing dishes at the temple. So very different spiritual practice after.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
So that sentence, if one says, I will recognize suffering, cut off the accumulation of suffering, realize extinction of suffering, and cultivate the path, this would be a contrived theory and not to seek the Dharma. This reminds me, of course, the line in the Heart Sutra, there's no path, there's no suffering, there's no cessation of suffering.
Yeah.
So the same
Yeah, absolutely the same idea that you see in the Heart Sutra. So in the Heart Sutra, what you see is, so here Vimalakirti is saying you have to cut off thinking, I'm going to achieve this in a 1, 2, 3, 4 step pattern that the Buddha taught. Did the Buddha teach that these are the steps? Yes. But he taught them as stages, as eventually you will see or recognize this. Not for you to go into it saying, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this. And in the Heart Sutra, you see Avalokiteshvara saying, oh, now I see. There is no path, right? Because I have attained it. Which is easy to say once you've attained it, right? Totally different to be on the other end of like going, well, where's the path? Because I need to walk it yet. So it's a matter of perspective. So when you have attained it, then you say, I discard that. I don't need it. Which is true. You don't need to necessarily keep track of your mantras. But while you're still walking the path, then it's useful. Right? It's of use. So these are the differences. So it's also a matter of, are there those stages? Yes. But if you are so attached to the stages along the way, you're not going to get very far. So that's where, and this is, my idea of like, well, how do you abandon seeking yet stay on the path? It's just that engagement with spiritual practice. You're engaging with the teaching in various ways. In fact, you have to engage with it in different ways. We are still humans. The Dharma is tailored to the needs of humans. And even within the sutra, you see the Buddha teaching in different ways. So in this sutra, remember the Buddha's still over in the garden in a different part of town, and he sent his students off to hear the Dharma from a totally different perspective. And that's a teaching method. And so they are thrown off. They are somewhat confused. They are going, well, what's going to happen? I'm not sure exactly. This is different than we normally do. And so there's that. They don't know what's coming. And so as Vimalakirti is laying out these teachings, they're coming as a surprise in many ways. Right? And also the huge surprise here is, well, it seems as though Vimalakirti can read our minds. So there's a lot that's going on that is out of the ordinary. So in that way, it can be a huge benefit to the students. In the same way that if you have a guest speaker in class, when teacher says, we've been talking about this subject, I'd like the guest speaker to come in, and the guest speaker talks about their own experience, then qualitatively your understanding is different. Right? So I remember, I think it was actually grade school. Yeah, it was grade school. We studied World War II and history, and then we went to the Holocaust Center. And so now I'm sitting at a table listening to a Holocaust survivor, and she's telling her story. And so you're like, okay, I've seen the movies, which at that time, this is before Schindler's List, so this is like, the old 1950s World War II movies. So everything was kind of whitewashed and not so gritty. And you've read the story about it, and you kind of know what happened, but then you hear from someone who experienced it, and your understanding is completely different. Right? So now when you go back and studying it again in the classroom, your appreciation for all of that period of history is completely different. In the same way that, I read about Buddhism. Then I get to college and there's an actual group of practicing Buddhists, and we have a monk come from Taiwan. And you're like, oh, wow, a real monk. Look, he's got robes and everything. Cool. And you're reading the sutra. Now it's different. Then you go to an American Buddhist center. Ooh, look, lots of meditation cushions in an old house. Neat. And then, you go to Asia and you see a temple that's thousands of years old, and you're like, oh, okay, now it's hitting me differently, right? And you realize, okay, now I'm standing on the Silk Road, and this book came across this path and has been translated and reprinted, and now I'm holding it in my hand in the latest iteration, and okay, that's heavy. Right? There's more. So your appreciation is and depth of understanding is different. So then when you practice it, you hold it and you practice it differently. The same way, I get to California. Oh, here's a Shingon temple. This temple's been here since the 50s. Wow, right? And of course, right, there's temples in Hawaii that are already over 100 years old. You go there and you're like, oh wow, right? Because these are not buildings that were something else that were turned into temples. Like people pulled tropical wood out, carved it, and built this. This has a different, right? So your appreciation for the structure and the energy that went into it is different. So all of those things, that's engagement, right? You're on the spiritual path, but your engagement with it is different. At that point, I don't think I walked in going, oh, I'm going to go to this older temple and that's where I'm going to do meditation to achieve enlightenment. No, I thought was just like, wow, imagine, the people, at this temple. In fact, there's actually one of the Shingon temples, they had to guard the temple at night because local people would come and try to burn it down. And then they had to start, people would drive by and shoot. And they didn't want them building a Buddhist temple in the area. So they had to, deal with that.
Alright.
You've got the latest immigrant group coming in and building a very large symbol of their faith, which is different from your faith. Yeah. And we can say that we've seen that more recently with different immigrant groups and different houses of worship.
Yeah.
But humans are predictably, human are the detritus of human emotions play out in this way. So then you look at that temple and you're like, man, that beyond all odds and a lot of hardship beyond just building it. And this is, before building codes, which meant the members themselves got together on the weekend and laid bricks or, carved the wood and planed the planks and laid it down. So this is what you get to walk into now. So that has a different, you're engaging with it differently. So that I think matters. Right? So that I think is how we can try to, how do we abandon seeking? It's an engagement model. And if you look around at, regardless of Buddhist school, there's always an engagement model. How do you enter the room? How do you hold the book? How do you put the robe on? How do you sit down on the meditation cushion? How do you meditate? That's all engagement with the teaching. Not, there's no sign, enter this doorway for enlightenment. That's not usually the way it's set up.
If it was, it'd just be over every doorway.
Yeah.
People would be like, I don't get it.
I know.
That's right.
And then someone would set up a booth and start selling tickets, this is the right one, so you got to give me $20 and I'll let you in. So this is kind of getting us back on the page of what the inconceivable is for Vimalakirti and Sariputra. So next time we get going a little bit more in depth to the details of the practice, but you see it again as an engagement model and a prescribed practice method in Shingon meditation and everything else. So, any questions before we do a little bit of meditation?